Boston, 2025. Rain drummed steadily against the windows of Harvard Divinity School's archives as Dr. Rebecca Collins carefully examined a collection of historical church photographs. The images had been recently donated by the Diocese of Massachusetts as part of a research project on early 20th century religious architecture in New England. Most photographs were unremarkable. Stiff portraits of congregations, documentation of church renovations, ceremonial occasions preserved for posterity. But one image captured Rebecca's attention, a formal portrait from 1908 showing St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Brookline during its 50th anniversary celebration. The photograph showed the church's ornate interior with its congregation assembled in Sunday finery. Central to the composition was the elaborately carved altar, behind which stood Reverend Thomas Aldrich, the church's rector, flanked by his vestry members. The image quality was exceptional for its era, capturing fine details throughout the church. Something about the altar nagged at Rebecca's trained eye. While the rest of the church featured Gothic revival elements typical of the period, the altar contained unusual carvings partly obscured by ceremonial cloth. Using a digital magnifier on her tablet, she enlarged that section of the photograph. Dr. Winters, she called to her colleague, a religious historian specializing in church artifacts. Could you look at these carvings? They don't match the period or denominational style. Dr. James Winters studied the enlarged image, his expression gradually shifting from professional interest to concern. Those aren't Episcopalian or even Christian symbols, he said quietly. That's a modified Eye of Providence, but with symbols I associate with Hermetic or occult traditions. And these side panels, they contain elements of ritual magic inscriptions. In an Episcopal church altar from 1908? Rebecca asked incredulously. Precisely why it's so unusual, Winters replied. Even more concerning, look at how the altar appears to have a concealed compartment. See the seam? That's not decorative. It's functional. Rebecca felt a chill despite the archive's careful climate control. What had begun as routine architectural research had suddenly revealed something far more intriguing and potentially disturbing. What was an altar with occult symbolism and hidden compartments doing in a mainstream Episcopal church in 1908? And what might have been concealed within it? We need to find out if St. Michael's still exists, she said, already reaching for her laptop, and whether that altar might still be there. The following morning found Rebecca and James standing before St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Brookline, its Gothic stone exterior largely unchanged since the 1908 photograph. The rain had cleared, leaving the autumn air crisp and bright as they climbed the worn stone steps. The church underwent significant renovation in the 1960s, James explained as they approached the entrance, but according to the diocese records, many of the original architectural elements were preserved or carefully restored. The heavy wooden doors opened to reveal a warm, sunlit interior. Rebecca immediately oriented herself based on the historical photograph, her eyes drawn to the front of the sanctuary where the altar would stand. Her breath caught. The altar was entirely different, a simple marble table in the modern style with none of the ornate woodwork from the 1908 image. May I help you? The voice belonged to a middle-aged woman emerging from a side door, her clerical collar identifying her as the current rector. Reverend, I'm Dr. Rebecca Collins from Harvard Divinity School, and this is my colleague, Dr. James Winters. We're researching historical church architecture and have some questions about the original altar that once stood here. Reverend Sarah Mitchell smiled warmly. You're in luck. I have a particular interest in St. Michael's history. The original altar was removed during the 1960s renovations, but it's preserved in our church basement museum. Would you like to see it? Leading them down a narrow staircase, Reverend Mitchell unlocked a heavy door, revealing a small museum housing artifacts from the church's 167-year history. Against the far wall stood the altar from the photograph, smaller than it had appeared in the image, but unmistakable with its ornate carvings and distinctive design. It was quite controversial when they replaced it. Reverend Mitchell explained, some older congregation members were deeply attached to it, despite its rather unusual design elements that weren't typical of Episcopal tradition. Rebecca and James exchanged glances, approaching the altar carefully. Up close, the symbols were even more clearly divergent from traditional Christian iconography, subtle modifications to traditional symbols that shifted their meaning significantly. Do you know anything about Reverend Thomas Aldrich, who led the church in 1908? Rebecca asked casually. Only that he served here for nearly 30 years before departing rather suddenly in 1911. There was some sort of controversy, though the church records are frustratingly vague. Local historical rumors suggest he had developed unconventional theological interests that concerned the diocese. As Reverend Mitchell was called away to attend to parish business, Rebecca and James carefully examined the altar. The seam visible in the photograph was indeed present, a thin line indicating a concealed compartment built into the altar's structure. We need permission to examine this more thoroughly, James whispered. If there really is a hidden compartment, we can't simply start prying at a historical church artifact. Rebecca nodded, already formulating her request to the church board. Whatever secrets this altar contained had remained hidden for over a century. A few more days of proper protocols wouldn't matter. What she couldn't have known was how profoundly the contents of that compartment would challenge her understanding of early 20th century religious life in respectable Brookline, Massachusetts. 3 days later, Rebecca and James returned to St. Michael's with formal permission to examine the altar. They were accompanied by Dr. Elena Martinez, a conservation specialist who would ensure any examination didn't damage the historical artifact. The church board was surprisingly enthusiastic about our research, Rebecca remarked as they set up their equipment in the basement museum. Apparently, there have been long-standing questions about this altar among church historians. Reverence for history only goes so far, Reverend Mitchell replied, joining them for the examination. We've always known something was unusual about this piece, but lacked the expertise to properly investigate it. Dr. Martinez conducted a preliminary non-invasive examination using a specialized scanner. There's definitely a void behind this panel, she confirmed. And based on these readings, I believe the opening mechanism is triggered by pressing these two particular decorative elements simultaneously. Following her guidance, James gently pressed the two carved rosettes she indicated. After a moment's resistance, they heard a faint click, and a previously invisible seam widened slightly. Dr. Martinez carefully inserted conservation tools to widen the gap without causing damage. The panel slid open to reveal a hidden compartment, approximately 12 inches square and 8 inches deep. Inside lay several carefully wrapped packages bound in deteriorating silk and protected by wax seals. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Martinez murmured, photographing everything before removal. These items were specifically preserved for long-term concealment. Following conservation protocols, they carefully transferred the packages to an examination table. The first contained a leather-bound journal with Reverend Aldrich's name inscribed on the cover, its pages filled with dense, meticulous handwriting. The second package revealed something more unexpected, a collection of occult texts, including a well-worn copy of the Book of Abramelin, a grimoire of ceremonial magic dating to the 15th century, and several manuscripts in cipher. These were not mass-market spiritualist texts common to the era's occult revival, but serious esoteric works that would have been deeply controversial in an Episcopal context. The third package contained the most disturbing items, ritual implements, including a silver ceremonial knife with inscriptions, a small chalice, and vials of dried substances labeled in the same handwriting as the journal. "This is not what I expected to find in an Episcopal church altar," Reverend Mitchell said, visibly unsettled. Rebecca had already begun examining the journal, her expression growing more troubled as she read. According to these entries, Reverend Aldrich was leading two congregations, his public Episcopal parish and a private esoteric group that met secretly in the church after hours. He refers to them as the Inner Covenant. James carefully examined one of the ciphered manuscripts. This appears to be a modified Trithemius cipher. It would take time to decode properly, but certain repeated symbols suggest this contains ritual instructions. But why hide these inside the altar itself? Reverend Mitchell asked. Rebecca turned to a later journal entry. According to this, Aldrich believed the altar stood at a specific convergence point of terrestrial energies. He designed it not just to conceal these items, but to amplify certain energies through their placement within it. She looked up at her colleagues. He was using the altar itself as an active component in whatever rituals he was performing here. The implication hung heavily in the room. A respected Episcopal rector had embedded occult symbolism in a hidden compartment for ritual items directly into the most sacred feature of his church, conducting secret ceremonies for years without detection by church authorities or his conventional congregation. Whatever had happened at St. Michael's in the early 1900s was far stranger than a simple case of architectural curiosity. Back in her university office, Rebecca carefully transcribed Reverend Aldrich's journal, its brittle pages requiring delicate handling despite their relatively good preservation within the altar. The narrative that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing, the spiritual journey of a mainstream clergyman into increasingly esoteric practices. Earliest entries from 1899 showed Aldrich as an intellectually curious but orthodox Episcopal priest. His turn toward alternative spirituality began after a personal tragedy. April 16th, 1900. Emily's passing has left a void no conventional faith seems able to fill. The church's platitudes about God's will ring hollow when my 4-year-old daughter lies in the earth. There must be more direct means of understanding the divine plan, and perhaps even communicating across the veil that separates us. Over subsequent entries, Aldrich documented his exploration of spiritualism, then progressively more obscure esoteric traditions. By 1904, he had formed his Inner Covenant with 7 parishioners who shared his interests. November 8th, 1904. Our circle now comprises 8 seekers, each committed to the higher work. Mrs. Westerly, Dr. Hammond, Professor Burke, Miss Calloway, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Pierce, and myself. All outwardly respectable members of the congregation, all inwardly seeking truths beyond conventional religion. We meet monthly under the guise of a parish committee, but our true work begins after the church is emptied. The most troubling entries concerned Aldrich's plans for the church's renovation in 1906, when the original altar was to be replaced. March 3rd, 1906. The opportunity I have awaited has arrived. The vestry has approved funds for a new altar, with the design ostensibly left to my discretion as rector. They will not recognize the symbols I have incorporated, subtle modifications that transform Christian iconography into keys for our work. Most brilliantly, the cabinet maker has agreed, for a substantial additional payment from my personal funds, to incorporate the hidden compartment according to my specifications. The altar will stand precisely at the convergence point I have identified through careful measurements. Rebecca paused in her reading, struck by the calculated deception. Aldrich had deliberately used his position of trust to embed occult elements into the church's most sacred furniture, with his congregation funding work whose true purpose they would have found horrifying. The entries following the altar's installation described escalating ritual activities. October 31st, 1907. Tonight's working exceeded all previous attempts. With the items properly positioned within the altar for a full lunar cycle, the veil thinned precisely as the ancient texts promised. The manifestation was brief but unmistakable. Hammond's skepticism has finally been silenced. Mrs. Thornton wept at the implications. What we have touched cannot be reconciled with Episcopal doctrine, yet feels more genuinely divine than anything in seminary teachings. Most concerning were the final entries from early 1911, where Aldrich's writings became increasingly erratic. February 14th, 1911. The entity we have contacted is not what we initially believed. Certain discrepancies in its communications have become apparent. Pierce noticed first subtle contradictions, knowledge gaps where omniscience should exist. I fear we may have opened a door to something neither divine nor benevolent. Mrs. Westerly has withdrawn from our covenant after her disturbing experience last week. I cannot blame her. The journal ended abruptly with an entry dated March 22nd, 1911. They are coming for me tomorrow. Bishop Harrington has summoned me to account for grave irregularities in my ministry. Someone has spoken. I have sealed our materials within the altar one final time. They may remove me from St. Michael's, but the work we began continues through the vessel we have consecrated. It will remain active long after I'm gone, waiting for those who know how to access its power. Rebecca sat back, processing the implications. According to diocesan records, Reverend Aldrich had resigned his position in April 1911, ostensibly for health reasons, and had relocated to Europe. There was no record of him ever returning to the United States. Whatever had happened at St. Michael's between 1906 and 1911 had been deliberately concealed by both Aldrich and the church authorities, who likely wanted to avoid scandal. But according to Aldrich's final entry, he believed their work had created something that would remain active within the church itself, something apparently centered on or contained within the altar that had sat undisturbed in the church basement for decades. Rebecca and James spent the next week researching the members of Aldrich's inner covenant as prominent church members in early 1900s Brookline. Most had left sufficient historical traces to construct their biographies. They were all respected community figures, James noted as they compiled their findings. Dr. William Hammond was chief of medicine at Brookline Hospital. Elizabeth Westerly was a prominent society widow who funded numerous charities. Thomas and Margaret Thornton owned one of Boston's largest department stores. These weren't fringe occultists. They were pillars of the community. Rebecca had been tracking Professor Arthur Burke, a physics instructor at MIT. Burke is particularly interesting. His early papers dealt with conventional electrical phenomena, but after 1907, his research shifted dramatically toward theories about etheric energies and vibrational resonance between material and non-material planes. His academic career effectively ended in 1910 when MIT declined to renew his contract. The most disturbing pattern emerged when they investigated what had happened to the group after Aldrich's departure. Dr. Hammond had committed suicide in July 1911, leaving a cryptic note about unbearable knowledge. Elizabeth Westerly had abruptly sold her Brookline mansion in April 1911 and moved to Arizona, where she lived in seclusion until her death in 1932. The Thorntons had divorced in late 1911, a scandalous decision in that era, with Margaret entering a sanatorium for what records euphemistically called nervous exhaustion. Something traumatic happened to this group, James observed. Their lives collectively fell apart in the months following Aldrich's removal from St. Michael's. Only 2 Covenant members had escaped apparent tragedy. Sophia Calloway, an unmarried schoolteacher, had continued teaching in Brookline until her retirement in 1931, though former students described her as intensely private and haunted by something. Harold Pierce had perhaps fared best, relocating to New York, where he established an antiquarian bookshop specializing in esoteric texts that still operated under family management. Most intriguing was what Rebecca discovered in Pierce's private papers. accessed through his granddaughter who now ran the bookshop. A journal entry from 1935 during a visit to Boston read, "I stood outside St. Michael's today, but could not bring myself to enter. The altar remains within those walls, though likely forgotten or repurposed by now. Better it stay forgotten. What we awakened there should never be disturbed again. I alone seem to have escaped the worst consequences of our hubris, perhaps because I was first to recognize what truly answered our calls. Not divine, not benevolent, but ancient and patient and hungry. Sometimes I still feel its attention turning toward me across the years, like a predator that has tasted blood and waits only for opportunity." Rebecca shared Pierce's entry with James, who had been translating the ciphered manuscript found in the altar. "This aligns with what I'm finding in the ritual text," he said grimly. Aldrich believed they were contacting angelic intelligences, but the ritual framework he constructed was fundamentally flawed. The protective elements were inadequate for the forces he was invoking. "Are you suggesting they actually contacted something?" Rebecca asked skeptically. James chose his words carefully. "I'm suggesting that Aldrich and his group believed they had established communication with a non-human intelligence. Whether that was objectively real or a shared psychological phenomenon, it clearly traumatized most of them. And Aldrich apparently believed that whatever they experienced remained somehow connected to the altar itself. Their research had transformed from historical curiosity to something more unsettling. A respected church rector had converted his altar into an occult tool, conducted secret rituals with prominent community members, and potentially experienced something so disturbing it had shattered their group and been deliberately concealed by church authorities. And the altar that had been at the center of it all still sat in St. Michael's basement, recently opened after more than a century of containment. Rebecca arranged to interview several elderly parishioners of St. Michael's, hoping they might have inherited stories about Reverend Aldrich or the altar's removal in the 1960s. Most knew only vague details, but one woman in her 90s, Martha Kincaid, whose grandmother had attended the church during Aldrich's tenure, offered intriguing family lore. Gran wouldn't speak of Reverend Aldrich directly, Martha explained as Rebecca recorded their conversation in the church's meeting room. But she warned us children never to remain in the church alone. She said the altar watched when no one was looking. "The altar watched?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Martha nodded. Childish fancy, I assumed. But Gran was otherwise a practical woman not given to superstition. She mentioned once that after Reverend Aldrich left, a small group of parishioners would take turns staying in the church at night. When I asked why, she said they were standing guard, though against what, she wouldn't say. This aligned with something James had discovered in church financial records, a curious payment from 1911 through 1962 to a special maintenance committee that met monthly but whose activities were never specified in vestry minutes. Martha continued, "When they removed the altar in 1963, Gran was still alive in her 80s. I remember her immense relief, saying, 'Thank God it's over. The watch can end.' When I asked what she meant, she said simply, 'Some burdens pass from generation to generation until they are properly laid to rest.'" After interviewing other parishioners, Rebecca pieced together a remarkable narrative. Following Aldrich's departure, a group of church members, possibly those who knew what had truly occurred, had established a tradition of maintaining constant vigilance over the altar. As original members aged or died, they recruited younger replacements, never fully explaining the purpose, but emphasizing the absolute necessity of the watch. This tradition had continued quietly for over 50 years, until the church renovation in the 1960s provided an opportunity to remove the altar from its original position. Even then, they had insisted it remain within church, property rather than being sold or destroyed, suggesting either continued caution or perhaps inability to dispose of it due to some perceived consequence. When Rebecca shared these findings with James, he made another connection. The church basement was renovated and blessed in an unusual ceremony in 1963, according to these records. Bishop Gardner personally consecrated the storage room where the altar was placed, a remarkable level of attention for what was ostensibly just a space for old furniture. They contained it, Rebecca said slowly. Whatever Aldrich and his group believed they had connected to, the church somehow knew and took precautions for decades. Most revealing was what Reverend Mitchell discovered in the personal papers of the rector, who had overseen the altar's removal in 1963, Reverend William Stanton. In a private letter to the bishop, he had written, "The transfer was completed yesterday as planned. The faithful watchers are finally released from their burden after 52 years of vigilance. While I remain skeptical about the necessity of these precautions, I respect the conviction with which they have maintained their vigil for over half a century. The altar is now doubly secured, removed from its activation point, and contained within consecrated walls, reinforced according to Gardner's specifications." The original watcher, Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, née Calloway, aged 82, wept with relief, repeating that her mother's promise was finally fulfilled. This reference to Eleanor Jenkins, née Calloway, caught Rebecca's attention immediately. Sophia Calloway was one of Aldrich's Inner Covenant members. This suggests her daughter became one of the watchers who guarded the altar for decades. Which raises the question, James said quietly, of what exactly they were watching for, and whether removing the items from the altar's compartment after all this time might have consequences they sought to prevent. Rebecca felt a chill as she considered the implications. What had begun as historical research had uncovered a multi-generational secret involving ritualized watchfulness over an altar that had been deliberately modified for occult purposes. And they had potentially disrupted whatever containment measures had been carefully maintained for over 5 decades. The first indication that something unusual was happening came from Reverend Mitchell's early morning phone call to Rebecca. There have been incidents at the church since we opened the altar, she explained, her typically composed voice showing strain. At first, just minor disturbances, objects moving between evening lockup and morning opening, unusual cold spots in the basement. But last night, our custodian quit after reporting a figure standing beside the altar when he was alone in the building. Rebecca and James returned to St. Michael's that afternoon, finding Reverend Mitchell visibly exhausted. I spent the night here, she admitted. I thought perhaps having clergy present might help. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like chanting coming from the basement. When I checked, there was nobody there, but the room was freezing. The altar's hidden compartment was open again, though I know we secured it. James examined the altar while Rebecca reviewed the security camera footage. The church's modern system showed clear anomalies. Unexplained light phenomena near the altar, momentary static interference, and most disturbing, a shadowy figure briefly visible at 3:17 a.m. that had no apparent source. This is precisely what Eleanor Jenkins and her watchers feared, Rebecca said quietly. Aldrich wrote that they had created a vessel that would remain active. By removing the contents and breaking the seals after all this time, we may have disrupted whatever equilibrium they established. You're not suggesting this is actually supernatural? Reverend Mitchell asked, her theological training clearly at odds with the evidence before her. James chose his words carefully. I'm suggesting that Aldrich and his group conducted rituals they believed established contact with something beyond their understanding. Whether that was objectively real or a shared psychological phenomenon, they took extensive measures to contain it. Those measures have now been disrupted. As they spoke, Dr. Martinez called with troubling news from the conservation lab where the altar items were being studied. We're experiencing equipment malfunctions and unusual phenomena. Temperature fluctuations, battery drains, and most concerning, the journal appears to be changing. Changing how? Rebecca asked. Certain passages have faded while others have become more prominent since yesterday, and there's writing appearing in the margins that wasn't visible during our initial examination, in a different hand than Aldrich's. Rebecca and James rushed to the conservation lab, where Dr. Martinez showed them the journal under specialized lighting. True to her report, certain passages had faded, while others seemed darkened, creating a new emphasis pattern throughout the text. Most disturbing were the marginal notes now visible, cramped, spidery writing that hadn't appeared in their initial examination. The marginal text repeated variations of a single phrase. The door remains open. I remain. I wait. I watch. I hunger. This is chemically impossible, Dr. Martinez stated flatly. These changes cannot be explained by any known conservation phenomenon. As they examined the journal, the laboratory lights flickered briefly. When they stabilized, a new line had appeared on the final page, in the same spidery handwriting. You have remembered me. I remember you. The 3 researchers stared at the impossible text. Whatever had been set in motion by Reverend Aldrich and his inner covenant in 1908 had apparently not ended with their disbanding. Something had remained connected to the materials sealed within the altar, something that was now manifesting in increasingly concerning ways. We need to understand exactly what Aldrich's group did, Rebecca said firmly, pushing aside her scientific skepticism in the face of the inexplicable evidence before them. And more importantly, how the original Watchers contained it afterward. Whatever's happening, it's escalating. As they left the laboratory, none of them noticed the security camera in the hallway tracking their movement, though no one was monitoring the system. In the empty church basement, the altar's hidden compartment slowly closed itself, the wood creaking in the silence of the deserted building. James worked through the night, decoding the ciphered manuscript, finally calling Rebecca at dawn. I've deciphered enough to understand what Aldrich was attempting, he explained, his voice tense with fatigue and concern. It's a modified Enochian ritual system, designed to open what he called a permanent aperture between spheres of existence. Meaning what, exactly? Rebecca asked. Meaning Aldrich wasn't just trying to communicate temporarily with whatever he believed existed beyond our reality. He was attempting to create a permanent connection, a door that wouldn't close. The altar wasn't just a hiding place. It was the door itself, constructed at what he calculated to be a convergence point of what he called telluric currents. Rebecca tried to process this, and he succeeded? Partially. According to both his journal and this ritual text, something did respond to their workings. But it wasn't what they expected. Pierce seems to have realized first that the entity they contacted was masquerading as something benevolent while actually being something else entirely. James explained that the ritual materials had been arranged inside the altar not just for concealment, but as components of an ongoing working, a sort of occult machine designed to maintain the connection Aldrich had established. When church authorities removed him in 1911, he had sealed everything in place, believing the connection would remain active. The watching tradition makes sense now, Rebecca realized. After Aldrich left, those who knew what had happened, possibly including Sophia Calloway, who defected from the group, established the watch to ensure nothing came through this door he had created. When they finally moved the altar in the 1960s, they believed they had neutralized it by removing it from its convergence point. But they didn't destroy it, James pointed out, which suggests they either couldn't or feared the consequences of trying. The implications were disturbing. For over 50 years, a rotating group of parishioners had maintained a vigil over an altar they believed contained some kind of dangerous connection to something beyond normal reality. Then, for another 60 years, the altar had sat dormant in the basement, the threat apparently neutralized by its relocation until they had unsealed the compartment and removed the ritual items, potentially reactivating whatever connection Aldrich had established. As if confirming their fears, Reverend Mitchell called with alarming news. The manifestations are intensifying. Last night, 3 separate witnesses reported seeing a figure in the church. Not a shadow this time, but what they described as a man in early 1900s clerical clothing. And the temperature drops are affecting the entire building now, not just the basement. Did they identify the figure? Rebecca asked, though she already suspected the answer. One of our oldest parishioners recognized him from a historical photograph. She says it was Reverend Thomas Aldrich. The pieces were falling into place with disturbing clarity. Aldrich had created his permanent aperture more effectively than perhaps even he had realized. Something had remained connected to the altar for over a century, contained by the watchers and then by relocation. By opening the hidden compartment and removing its contents, they had potentially compromised whatever barriers had been maintained for generations. We need to recreate the original containment, Rebecca decided. Return everything to the altar exactly as we found it, reseal it, and consult with the religious authorities about more permanent solutions. There's a problem with that approach, James said grimly. According to the ciphertext, the original binding required 8 participants forming a precise geometrical arrangement around the altar. Aldrich's inner covenant. We have the materials and location, but not the human component that made the binding effective. Rebecca considered this challenge as reports of increasingly concerning phenomena continued to arrive from St. Michael's. Whatever had been awakened was growing stronger, manifesting more frequently, and showing signs of intelligence and purpose. They needed to act quickly before the situation escalated beyond their ability to contain. Rebecca spent hours researching how the original Watchers had managed the situation after Aldrich's departure. The breakthrough came from Eleanor Jenkins' personal papers, which her family had donated to the Brookline Historical Society after her death in 1970. They didn't try to close Aldrich's door completely. Rebecca explained to James and Reverend Mitchell as they gathered in the church office. They knew they couldn't recreate his original ritual. Instead, they established a containment protocol based on regular consecration and vigilance. Eleanor's papers revealed that her mother, Sophia Calloway, had broken away from Aldrich's covenant after recognizing the true nature of what they had contacted. Unable to convince the others immediately, she had secretly consulted with a Jesuit priest with expertise in both theology and esoteric matters, Father Michael Doherty from Boston College. After Aldrich's removal, Sophia and Father Doherty had developed a hybrid containment approach, combining elements from Catholic protective rituals, Episcopal consecration rites, and modified versions of the same Hermetic principles Aldrich had exploited, but inverted for containment rather than communion. Most crucially, they had discovered they couldn't permanently close the connection without risking a dangerous backlash. Instead, they established a system of regular observances that kept the entity in a dormant state as long as the rituals were maintained, and the altar remained under watch. That's why they insisted on keeping the altar on church grounds even after removing it from the sanctuary, James realized. The containment was partially dependent on its remaining within consecrated space. Eleanor's papers included the specific ritual procedures the Watchers had performed monthly for decades. Prayers, anointings, and ceremonial actions designed to maintain the barriers between worlds. When the altar was relocated in 1963, Bishop Gardner had apparently incorporated permanent protective elements into the basement room's construction. Consecrated objects sealed into the walls, specific geometrical arrangements, and blessing rituals performed during the renovation. We have everything we need, Rebecca said. The original containment procedures, the altar in its consecrated space, and even an advantage they lacked. We've removed the ritual objects that served as the primary conduit. If we return them properly and reinstate the watching protocols, we should be able to restore the dormant state. There's a missing element, Reverend Mitchell pointed out. The original Watchers were all connected to people who knew the truth. family members of those involved, maintaining their vigil out of personal commitment. We're outsiders to the situation. Rebecca had considered this. Eleanor's papers address that too. The connection works both ways. Once you interact with this phenomenon, you become part of its awareness. We've all experienced the manifestations. We've handled the materials. As she put it, once it knows you, you're bound to it, and it to you. We're already connected, which actually gives us the standing to perform the containment. That evening, they prepared the church basement according to Eleanor's specifications. The altar items were carefully returned to their compartment in the precise arrangement documented in their initial examination. Reverend Mitchell, drawing on her episcopal authority, performed the consecration rituals, while Rebecca and James completed the geometric arrangements of symbolic objects around the altar. As they worked, the manifestations intensified. Temperature drops, electrical disturbances, and brief glimpses of a figure moving at the edge of their vision. The sense of being watched was palpable, creating an atmosphere of mounting tension as they completed the preparations. The final step required all three to recite the containment invocation. Preserved in Eleanor's papers, a strange hybrid of Latin liturgy, episcopal prayer, and Hermetic formula that acknowledged the entity's existence while firmly restricting its influence. As they spoke the final words, the basement was plunged into total darkness for several seconds. When emergency lights activated, they found the altar's hidden compartment had sealed itself. The seam, now nearly invisible as it had been before their investigation began. The immediate sense of presence that had permeated the room had diminished, though not disappeared entirely. Something remained, but it felt contained, restrained, returned to the dormant state that had been maintained for decades before their intervention. It worked, James said quietly. But this is a maintenance protocol, not a permanent solution. Like our predecessors, we've contained rather than banished, which means the watching tradition needs to continue. Reverend Mitchell realized, the weight of this new responsibility evident in her expression. As Eleanor put it, some burdens pass from generation to generation. Rebecca nodded, understanding now why the original Watchers had maintained their vigil for so long, and why they had carefully recruited replacements as they aged. What Aldrich had begun could not be simply ended, only vigilantly managed by those who understood the necessity of their work. They had restored the equilibrium, but in doing so, had themselves become links in the chain of responsibility that now would need to continue into the future. 1 year later, Rebecca returned to St. Michael's for the monthly observance. The basement room had been redesigned as a meditation chapel, providing a legitimate reason for regular ceremonial activity around the altar without revealing its true purpose to the broader congregation. Reverend Mitchell greeted her at the door. "What? How are the new historical articles being received?" She asked as they walked through the quiet church. "Better than I expected," Rebecca replied. "The heavily redacted version of events has been accepted as an interesting case study of early 20th century religious experimentation. No one questions why we've obscured certain details or why we've emphasized Aldrich's unconventional theology rather than the full truth." James was waiting for them in the basement chapel, where soft lighting and tasteful religious imagery now disguised the room's true function. The altar stood against the wall, appearing to casual observers as simply a historical church artifact preserved for its artistic value. "Any manifestations since last month?" Rebecca asked as they prepared the space. "Minor temperature fluctuations, nothing more," James replied. "The containment is holding, though I still sense attention when I'm alone here." The monthly ritual had been streamlined from Eleanor Jenkins' original procedures, but maintained the essential elements: renewal of consecration, recognition of boundaries, and acknowledgement of the Watcher's commitment. As the three completed the observance, Rebecca felt the now familiar sense of the entity's awareness receding slightly, returning to its dormant state for another month. "We should discuss succession planning," Reverend Mitchell said as they concluded. "None of us is getting younger, and like the original Watchers, we need to ensure continuity." Rebecca nodded, understanding the weight of this responsibility.